The track beneath your feet is barely wider than your two boots placed side by side, a ribbon of pressed-down heather and dark earth that winds between pools of still black water and hummocks of wiry grass. With each step the ground gives a soft, wet resilience that springs back after you lift your foot, leaving a faint temporary impression that slowly fills with brown water from below. You feel the weight of your body transfer through your legs into the bog, a sensation of being both held and slowly absorbed, and you adjust your pace to match the land's own rhythm. A slow, deliberate walking that wastes no energy. The air temperature is cool enough that you can see your breath for a moment before it dissolves, yet not so cold that your fingers stiffen around the spade's handle, a balanced coolness typical of an Irish May morning before the sun has climbed high enough to warm the open ground. Overhead, the sky is a single unbroken sheet of grey cloud that diffuses the light evenly so that nothing casts a strong shadow. Everything appears in a kind of soft, shadowless illumination that blurs the edges of things and makes the whole bog feel like one continuous surface. You shift the spade on your shoulder and feel the slight rub of the iron socket against the bone, a familiar pressure that you have known since you first learned this work, and you let your eyes travel along the blade's length. The spade's cutting edge is straight and sharp, angled just enough to slice through the dense fibrous peat without tearing it, while the wing, a flange of iron bent to the right angle along one side, stands ready to cut the vertical face of each turf so that it comes away clean and square. Light, even this early diffuse light, catches the polished steel of the blade's bevel and gleams with a dull, watery sheen, a tiny spark of brightness in all the muted browns. The handle is made of ash, you think, or perhaps beech, its grain long since darkened by sweat and peat-stained hands. And it has a slight curve near the top that fits the palm when you push down with your foot on the blade's shoulder. As you walk, you run your thumb along the wood, feeling the tiny ridges and valleys worn into it, each a record of a grip, a season, a cutter long gone who once stood on this same bog under this same grey sky. To your left, a stretch of open ground rises almost imperceptibly toward a low ridge where the heather grows thicker and darker, and to your right, the land falls away into a shallow basin where water gleams like a sheet of dull silver among the rushes. You hear no voices, no sounds of any other person, only the soft shush of your own feet in the vegetation, and, far off, the thin, piping call of a curlew that echoes once and then fades into the vast, absorbing silence. This absence of human noise is not emptiness, but a kind of fullness, as if the bog itself is listening, and your presence here is a small, quiet note in a much larger stillness. You breathe in slowly through your nose, drawing the cold air deep into your lungs, and you catch the sharp, rooty smell of the peat itself, a scent that is both ancient and immediate, like the distilled essence of all the plants that have grown and died and sunk into this wet ground over 1,000 years. After walking for a few minutes, you come to the place where you will work, a patch of bog that you have chosen because the heather is thin here, and the peat below feels deep and even underfoot. You stop and lower the spade from your shoulder, setting the tip of the blade lightly on the ground in front of you, and you stand for a moment without moving, simply looking at the spot and feeling the land's quiet acceptance of your arrival. The heather around your boots is short and wiry, interspersed with patches of pale green sphagnum moss that glisten with trapped dew, and a few feet away, a small pool of dark water, no bigger than a cartwheel, mirrors the grey sky in perfect stillness. You push aside a few strands of heather with the side of your foot, clearing a small area down to the bare dark peat, and you see that the surface is crisscrossed with tiny root fibers and the dried remnants of last year's grasses, a thin skin over the deep, dense layers below. This is the exact spot where you will make the first cut, and the thought brings with it a quiet sense of beginning, a calm anticipation that settles in your chest like a stone sinking slowly through water. You bend down and pull away the loose vegetation with your hands, the heather stems breaking with soft, dry snaps, the moss coming up in damp, spongy clumps that you shake free of excess water before piling them to one side. The pile will later serve as kindling once it has dried in the wind, and you build it carefully, laying the stems in one direction so that they will catch the breeze. As you work, your fingers grow cold and wet, stains slightly brown from the peat water, and you wipe them absently on the coarse fabric of your breeches before reaching for the next handful. The bog surface now lies exposed in a strip about 2 hand widths wide and the length of your arm, a dark, wet face that glistens and smells of earth and deep time. You stand up straight again and rest your hands on the top of the spade's handle, looking down at the cleared strip, and you feel the stillness return. Heavier, now that you have stopped moving, like a blanket settling over your shoulders. The wind, such as it is, touches your face with the barest pressure, a cool, dry edge that comes from somewhere beyond the ridge and carries with it the faint, sweet scent of drying grass from the higher pastures. You turn your head slightly and watch the bog cotton bow and rise again, its white tufts like tiny flags signaling a breeze that you can barely feel. And you notice how the light has changed just a little, the grey overhead brightening by a single shade toward a pale, milky white that promises no sun but softens the whole sky. A lark begins to sing somewhere high above, its notes falling down through the layers of air like a fine scattered rain of sound, and you listen without moving, letting each phrase complete itself before the next begins. The bog, the sky, the wind, the distant bird all seem to be part of the same slow, ongoing rhythm, and you are simply another part of it, standing still with a spade in your hands, waiting to begin. You take the wing-spade in both hands now, your right hand gripping the handle just below the curved top, your left hand lower down where the wood is smoother, and you lift the blade a few inches off the ground to feel its weight. It is not a heavy tool, but it has a certain heft, a balanced mass that will do much of the work for you if you let it. You turn it over and look at the wing again, the way the iron is folded and hammered into a clean, sharp corner, and you test the edge with the ball of your thumb, finding it just sharp enough to cut the fibrous peat without being so sharp that it would chip on a hidden stone. The spade has been cared for, you can see. There is no rust, only a dark patina that comes from years of contact with the acidic bog water, a kind of seasoned skin on the metal that protects it while it works. You return the blade to the ground and press the tip lightly into the peat at the very edge of the cleared strip, aligning it so that the wing faces outward, ready to cut the vertical side of the first turf. The blade enters with a soft, wet sigh, a sound so quiet that it is almost swallowed by the open air, and you feel the slight resistance of the fibrous peat transmitted up through the iron and wood into your palms, a resistance that is not difficult but merely present, like the land's gentle way of reminding you that it is old and dense and does not yield without acknowledgement. You pause there, the spade standing upright in the ground, and you look again at the landscape around you, at the muted browns and greens, the still pool, the trembling bog cotton, the low, soft sky that holds everything in a dome of quiet light. You are ready, and the morning is ready, and the first cut waits like a word unspoken, held in the calm air of May 1740. You lower yourself to your knees on the soft, damp ground, feeling the cool moisture of the bog seep slowly through the coarse fabric of your breeches, a sensation that is not unpleasant but simply part of the morning's slow, patient work. The cleared patch of dark peat lies before you, its surface glistening faintly in the diffuse grey light, but around it the heather, moss, and wiry grasses still stand in a thick, tangled mat that must be removed before the first turf can be cut. You place the wing-spade on the ground beside you within easy reach, its iron blade resting flat on the heather and the handle angled upward so that you can grasp it without rising, and you lean forward onto your hands to examine the surface more closely. At this level, the bog reveals a small, intricate world of tiny stems, pale green sphagnum tips, reddish-brown roots, and the dark, wet peat just beneath, all woven together into a living skin that has formed over centuries of growth and decay. You notice how the heather branches are interlaced with the fine, thread-like roots of the bog cotton, how the moss grips the peat in soft, bulging cushions, and how the whole surface springs back slightly when you press it with your palm, as if the ground itself were one vast, shallow cushion laid over the deeper wetness below. You begin with your hands, taking hold of a clump of heather close to the cleared strip where the stems are shorter and easier to grasp, and you pull gently at first, testing the hold of the roots in the peat. The stems come away with a soft, tearing sound, not a snap, but a slow, fibrous separation, as the thin roots release their grip on the dark soil and you feel the slight resistance through your fingers, a tug that travels up your forearm and into your shoulder. You place the pulled stems in a small neat pile on the higher ground just behind you, laying them all in the same direction so that they will dry evenly when the wind picks up later in the day, and you reach for the next handful. The work has no hurry in it. Each pull is a deliberate, careful act, and you take the time to shake the loose peat from the roots before adding the stems to the growing pile, tapping them lightly against your palm so that dark crumbs fall back onto the ground. Your hands grow steadily colder and wetter as you work, the moisture from the moss and the peat water seeping into your skin and darkening the fabric at the cuffs of your sleeves. But you do not mind this. It is a familiar cold, the kind that comes with working the bog and that will be warmed later by the labor itself. As you clear a wider patch, you encounter the thicker, older heather stems that grow closer to the ground. Their base is twisted and woody where they have survived several seasons, and these require a firmer grip and a steady, even pull to break them free. You wrap both hands around a stubborn stem, one above the other, and lean back slowly, using the weight of your body rather than a sharp jerk. And the root gives way with a deep, wet sigh that you feel as much as hear, a vibration through the peat that tells you how far the roots extended. The hole left behind is a small dark socket that quickly fills with brown water from the surrounding peat, and you pause to watch the water rise and settle, the surface becoming still and reflective like a tiny dark mirror of the sky. You add the woody stem to the kindling pile, noticing that it is heavier and will dry more slowly, and then you turn your attention to the moss, which comes away in large, spongy pads that drip water down your wrists as you lift them. The moss is cool and slippery against your palms, its texture soft and yielding, and you squeeze it lightly to press out some of the water before setting it aside, the water trickling through your fingers and darkening the peat beneath. The pile of cleared vegetation grows steadily behind you, a low mound of heather, moss and grass that already looks different from the living cover still in place, its colors duller, and its stems beginning to lose their springiness as they sit in the open air. You turn your head to look at it, satisfied by its neat, orderly shape. And then you return to the work, your hands now moving with a slow, practiced rhythm that requires no conscious thought. The bog is very quiet around you, the only sounds being the soft, wet tearing of the roots, the occasional squelch of your knees shifting on the peat, and a distant, lonely call of the curlew that you heard earlier, now fainter and farther to the east. A very slight breeze stirs the bog cotton and brushes your face with a cool, dry touch that is welcome against the dampness on your skin, and you raise your head for a moment to breathe it in, letting the air fill your lungs before you exhale slowly and return your gaze to the ground. The sky overhead is still a uniform grey, but a subtle brightening in the east suggests that the sun is climbing behind the clouds, and the quality of the light has shifted from pale silver to a warmer, milky tone that softens every contour of the land. You reach for the wing-spade now, no longer content to work only with your hands, because some of the roots run deeper and are too tough to pull, and you take the blade in one hand while the other grips the handle, lifting it from the heather and positioning the tip at the edge of the cleared strip. The iron feels cold and heavy after the softer texture of the peat and moss, and you run your thumb along the edge to check that it is still clean and sharp, a habit that comes from years of working with tools that must be kept in good order. You press the blade downward at a shallow angle just beneath the surface, not to cut a full turf, but to slice through the thin, lateral roots that spread through the top few inches of the peat, and you push forward with a slow, steady pressure that the sharp edge easily carries through the fibrous strands. The spade makes a quiet, hissing sound as it moves through the wet peat, a sound like a knife drawn through damp sand, and you watch the root ends spring apart as the blade passes, the cut surfaces pale and clean against the dark background. You work the spade along the cleared strip in short, controlled strokes, peeling back the topmost layer of peat and vegetation in a thin, curling shaving that you lift away and add to the pile, and with each pass the exposed surface becomes smoother and more even, a uniform dark brown that is ready to receive the first true cut. The cleared strip now extends in front of you the width of your two hands and the length of your arm, a clean, flat ribbon of exposed peat that glistens wetly in the soft morning light. You set the spade aside again and lean forward to inspect the surface, running your fingertips over the cold, spongy peat and feeling the tiny, fibrous hairs that still protrude from the cut. The texture is like thick, wet felt, springy but dense, and when you press your fingernail into it, the mark fills slowly with water from the surrounding peat, a sign that the bog is well saturated and the turves will be heavy. You pick out a few remaining root fragments that the spade missed, the thin, white threads of bog cotton roots and the darker, wiry roots of the heather, and you toss them onto the pile with a flick of your wrist, clearing the strip completely. The air fills with the sharp acidic scent of freshly exposed peat, a smell that is at once clean and earthy, with a faint, sweet undertone like that of decaying wood, and you breathe it in deeply, finding it familiar and grounding, like the smell of home. You stretch out your back now, rising from your knees for a moment, and standing to ease the stiffness that has settled into your hips and shoulders, and you look out over the work you have done. The cleared strip is a narrow, dark line in the midst of the grey-green bog, a clean incision that contrasts sharply with the tangled vegetation on either side, and you see how the water trapped in the peat is already beginning to seep out along the cut edges, forming tiny, glistening droplets that catch the light. Behind you, the pile of heather and moss sits neatly on the higher ground, its stems already showing the first signs of drying as the wind moves through them, and you note that it will make good kindling in a few days, once the sun and air have done their work. You turn your gaze to the bog around you, taking in the wide, flat expanse of browns and muted greens, the still dark pools, the nodding white heads of the bog cotton, and the low, soft sky that holds everything in a dome of quiet light. There is no sign of anyone else, no smoke rising from the distant farmstead, no movement on the track. It is as if the whole world has paused, and you are the only person awake in it, the only figure standing on this ancient, slowly breathing land. The breeze freshens slightly, turning from a drift to a steady, gentle flow that comes from the southwest, and carries with it the faint, salty tang of the distant sea, a smell that mingles with the peat and the heather to create a complex, layered scent, unlike anything else. You close your eyes for a moment and simply stand, letting the wind move around you, feeling it cool the damp patches on your clothing and dry the moisture on your forehead, and you listen to the tiny sounds it makes as it passes through the heather, a soft, continuous rustle that is so constant it becomes a kind of silence in itself. The curlew calls again, closer now, and you open your eyes to see the bird flying low over the bog, its long, curved beak silhouetted against the grey sky, its wings beating slowly and evenly as it crosses from one stretch of open ground to another before disappearing behind a low rise. You watch the place where it vanished for a long moment, then sigh softly and lower yourself back to your knees, returning to the work with a renewed sense of calm. There is more surface to clear before you can cut the first turf, because the strip must be wide enough to work comfortably and long enough to yield a good number of turves without having to shift your position too often, and you resume the slow, methodical pulling and scraping with the same patience as before. You work your way along the edge of the cleared patch, widening it by another hand's width on each side, and you find that the heather here is thicker and more stubborn, its roots running deeper into the peat, where the ground is a little drier and less waterlogged. These roots require the spade again, and you use the blade to cut them free with short, precise strokes, angling the iron beneath the surface and prying upward gently, so that the whole root mass lifts away in a single heavy mat that you can roll aside with both hands. The mat is surprisingly heavy, its underside thick with tinging peat that drops away in soft, wet clumps as you move it, and you are careful to shake as much of the peat back onto the ground as possible before adding the vegetation to the pile. By now your hands are completely stained a deep reddish brown, the color of the peat itself, and the lines of your palms and the creases of your knuckles are etched in dark, wet lines that will take days to fade. You pause to wipe your hands on a dry patch of heather, scrubbing them briskly to remove the worst of the stickiness, and you notice for the first time that the light has changed again, the grey of the sky becoming brighter and more luminous, as if the sun is now fully risen behind the clouds and is pushing its light through the overcast in a soft, diffuse glow. The warmth of it, though very slight, touches the back of your neck and shoulders, taking the edge off the morning chill, and you feel your muscles relax slightly in response, the tension of the early start easing out of them. You take a small drink of water from the leather bottle that hangs from your belt. the water cool and tasting faintly of the leather itself, and you replace the stopper carefully before setting the bottle aside on the higher ground, where it will not be trampled or lost. The small drink refreshes you, and you return to the work with a clear head and steady hands. The cleared surface now extends before you like a dark rectangular canvas, its dimensions roughly the height of a man and twice as wide, and you walk around it slowly, inspecting every part of it to ensure that no large roots or stones remain hidden beneath the surface. The peat here is deep and even, you can tell, because your feet do not strike any hard objects when you tread on it, only the soft, uniform springiness that speaks of layer upon layer of uninterrupted accumulation. In one corner, a small stone does protrude, a smooth, rounded piece of quartz that catches the light with a dull, milky gleam, and you bend to pry it out with the tip of the spade, working it loose from its socket and tossing it onto the dry ground beyond the cleared area. The stone leaves behind a small water-filled hollow that slowly drains as you watch, the water seeping away into the surrounding peat, and you smooth the edges of the hole with your fingertips so that the surface is flat and even once more. You stand back and survey the whole cleared patch, and you feel a quiet, steady satisfaction, not a proud or loud feeling, but a simple, calm acknowledgement that the ground is ready, that the preparation is complete, and that the first true cut is now only a moment away. You gather the last few handfuls of loose vegetation from the edges, tidying the perimeter so that the cleared area is sharply defined against the surrounding heather, and you add these final stems to the kindling pile, which has now grown into a substantial mound that stands as a small landmark on the otherwise featureless bog. You rearrange the pile slightly, tucking in stray stems and patting the sides to make them neat, and then you straighten your back for the final time, placing your hands on your hips and breathing deeply of the cool, peat-scented air. The morning has advanced while you worked, the light now fully settled into the steady, shadowless brightness of an overcast May day, and the bog has come a little more alive around you. A dragonfly hovers over a dark pool for a moment before darting away, and a meadow pea-pit flits low over the heather, its small, quick movements catching your eye. You follow the bird's flight for a second or two, then lower your gaze to the cleared ground at your feet, and you see it for what it is, a beginning, a blank, patient surface that holds within it all the turves of the coming winter, waiting only for the first cut of the wing-spade. You position the wing-spade at the very edge of the cleared strip, where the dark exposed peat meets the still living heather, and you place the tip of the blade precisely on the spot you marked in your mind as the beginning. The iron rests there for a moment, a cold, sharp line against the soft, yielding ground, and you feel the handle's worn smoothness under your right palm, the lower shaft steady beneath your left. You draw a slow, deep breath that fills your lungs with the cool, peat-scented air, and you let it out just as slowly, watching the faint wisp of your breath appear and vanish, before you press the spade downward with the ball of your foot on the blade's broad shoulder. The edge shifts into the peat with a low, wet sigh that travels up through the iron and wood into your hands, a sound that is not loud but distinct, the voice of the ground parting for the first time. You push deeper by stepping more fully onto the shoulder of the blade, transferring your weight from your back foot to your front in a smooth, unhurried motion, and the spade slides down through the dense, fibrous layers with a steady, even resistance that speaks of centuries of compacted growth. The wing on the left side cuts the vertical wall cleanly as it descends, shearing through the hair-thin roots and the compressed stems of ancient mosses, separating a neat, rectangular block from the mass of the bog, while you feel the slight vibration of each severed fiber through the handle. When the blade has sunk to its full depth, the top of the iron level with the surface of the peat, you pause and adjust your grip, moving your left hand higher on the shaft while your right hand settles into the curved top of the handle that fits your palm like a well-worn cup. You pull back on the handle slowly, using it as a lever against the fulcrum of the blade's buried corner, and the resistance changes from a downward pressure to a lateral tension as the peat begins to loosen from its ancient bed. The motion is deliberate and economical, no sudden effort or jerking, only a steady, patient pull that you feel in your shoulders and across your back. And then with a soft sucking release, the turf comes free, its bottom face tearing from the deeper peat with a sound like thick fabric ripping underwater. You lift the spade and its burden together, the blade flat and level so that the turf does not slide off, and you step back from the cut edge with the same careful pace, watching the rectangular block wobble slightly on the iron as you move. The turf is heavier than a casual glance would suggest, dense with water that fills every pore and fiber, and your forearms feel the weight as you carry it a few steps to a patch of flat dry heather where you intend to lay it down. You lower the spade and tilt the blade sideways with a gentle twist of your wrists, and the turf slides off the smooth iron onto the ground, landing with a soft, wet thump that presses a shallow depression into the heather beneath it. For a moment you simply stand and look at it, this first dark block resting on the pale green and brown vegetation, its cut faces glistening in the diffuse morning light like polished black-brown marble. The top surface, which until a moment ago faced upward to the open sky, is a mat of flattened heather and moss, the individual stems crushed by the weight of the peat above them and still glistening with the moisture that drips slowly from their tips. The three cut sides, sliced cleanly by the blade, are smooth and nearly featureless except for the faint horizontal lines where the spade passed through the denser layers of the peat, and the bottom face is rougher, the surface where the turf tore from the deeper layers showing a fibrous, ragged texture with tiny hanging threads of pale root and dark, decomposed plant matter. You walk slowly around the turf, your eyes tracing each side and edge, and you notice how the color is not uniform but shifts from a deep wet brown on the freshly cut faces to a slightly lighter, redder tone near the top where the peat is younger and less compressed. The turf seems almost to breathe in the open air, the exposed surfaces glistening and steaming faintly as the first moisture begins to evaporate from them, and the sharp acidic scent of cut peat rises strongly now, filling the space around you with its clean, rooty fragrance. You kneel beside the turf and touch its cut surface with your fingertips, feeling the cold, damp smoothness and the slight, spongy give of the saturated peat under gentle pressure. The texture is unlike anything else, not quite soil, not quite wood, but something in between. A dense, fibrous mass that holds its shape firmly yet yields just enough to the touch to remind you that it is mostly water. Tiny pinpricks of moisture bead on the surface where your fingers have pressed, the water of countless seasons being slowly squeezed from the pores, and you lift your hand to see the dark brown stain already marking your fingertips, a stain that will deepen over the hours ahead until your hands are the same color as the peat itself. You wipe your fingers absently on the thigh of your breeches, leaving a faint damp smear, and then you reach for the turf with both hands to turn it over, placing it grass-side down on the heather so that the cut surfaces are exposed to the moving air. The turf feels heavier in your hands than it looked on the spade, perhaps 30 pounds or more, its weight concentrated and solid like a block of soaked wood, and you settle it carefully into its new position, adjusting the angle slightly so that it sits level and will not roll or tip. The grass and heather on the underside are already darkening with the moisture pressing down into them, and you know that in a few hours they will be flattened and beginning to dry, the first stage of a long, slow transformation that will turn this wet, heavy block into a light, brittle piece of winter fuel. You stand up again and return to the cut face, where the rectangular socket left by the first turf is already filling with dark brown water that seeps from the surrounding peat in a steady, silent flow. The water rises quickly at first, then slows as the pressure equalizes, and within a minute the socket has become a small, still pool that mirrors the grey sky with perfect clarity, a tiny, dark window into the water table of the bog. You look into it and see your own reflection, a dim brown-tinged shape that shifts slightly as the water continues to seep, and you note that the bottom of the socket, the new surface of the cut face, is as smooth and even as the sides of the turf you just removed. The blade has done its work well, leaving a clean, vertical wall that is ready for the next cut, and the wing has kept the corner sharp and square so that the next turf will abut perfectly against this one without leaving a gap. You lower the spade into position once more, aligning the blade with the wall of the socket so that the wing rides against the cut face, and you prepare to make the second cut of the morning. This second cut is easier than the first, not because the peat is different, but because your body has now learned the motion, your muscles remembering the exact sequence of press, lever, and lift, and the spade sinks into the ground with a familiar, practiced ease that comes from repetition. You push down with your foot, pull back on the handle and feel the turf release with the same soft sucking sound, the same slight quiver through the wood, and you lift it onto the spade and carry it to the spot beside the first turf where it will lie and dry. You turn it grass side down as before, positioning it parallel to the first block with a gap of a few inches between them so that the wind can pass through and reach both cut faces, and you step back to look at the two turves lying side by side, dark and glistening against the heather. They are nearly identical in size and shape, each a rectangle the length of your forearm and the width of your spread hand, and together they form the beginning of a line that will grow across the bog as the day progresses, a long dark column of drying fuel stretching from the cut face to the higher ground. You return to the cut face and repeat the motion again, and again, and again, each cut blending into the next, in a slow rhythmic sequence that begins to feel as natural as breathing. The spade sinks, the turf releases, the blade lifts, you carry the block to the line, you turn it, you place it, you walk back, and the cycle starts anew with a quiet, steady regularity that occupies your whole attention while leaving your mind free to drift. You notice the way the light shifts imperceptibly across the bog, the clouds moving slowly from west to east in a great, silent procession, and you hear the wind rising and falling in the heather like the distant sound of a calm sea. The pile of cut turves behind you grows by 1, then 2, then 5, then 10. Each new block a small dark addition to the line that marks your progress across the morning, and the cut face before you deepens and lengthens with every extraction, the trough extending further into the bog as you work your way along the cleared strip. After a time you pause and straighten your aching back, placing the spade upright in the ground and leaning on its handle while you survey what you have done. The line of turves now stretches a good distance behind you, a dozen or more dark rectangles lying grass down on the heather in an orderly row, their cut faces already beginning to lose the high gloss of saturation and take on a duller, darker finish as the wind draws the first moisture from them. The trough from which they came is a clean, square-edged channel in the bog, its floor wet and glistening, its walls straight and true, and you feel a quiet satisfaction in the orderliness of it, the simple geometry of the work rising from the formless expanse of the bog. Around you, the morning continues in its slow, ancient way, the curlew calling again from somewhere to the north, the bog cotton swaying in the steady breeze, the grey sky holding its soft, even light over everything. And you stand there for a long, peaceful moment, with your hands resting on the worn wooden handle, breathing the cool, peaty air and letting the stillness of the bog settle back into you before you lift the spade and begin again. You return to the cut face and take up the wing spade once more, your hands finding their places on the worn handle without conscious thought, the right palm settling into the curved top and the left gripping the smooth shaft lower down where the wood is darkened by the touch of many seasons. The trough you have already opened stands before you, a shallow, straight-sided channel in the bog, its floor dark and wet, its walls cut clean and square by the wing of the blade, and you step down into it carefully, feeling the cold, soft peat yield under your boots and the water seep up around the soles. The cut face rises in front of you now at the height of your shins, a vertical wall of dense, fibrous peat that glistens faintly in the diffuse light, and you position the spade at the far end where the wall is still fresh and untouched, aligning the wing with the corner so that the next turf will be exactly the same width as all the ones before. The blade sinks in with that same low, wet sigh you have come to know, a sound that is no longer new but has become the steady, repeating note of the morning, as regular as the beat of your own heart. And you press it down with your foot, lean your weight into it, and feel the peat part around the iron with a slow, even resistance that tells you the ground here is consistent and free of hidden stones or thick roots. The turf comes away cleanly, the bottom face tearing from the deeper layers with a soft, sucking release that you feel through the handle as a brief, dull vibration, and you lift it onto the blade and carry it the few steps to the growing line of dark rectangles that now stretches across the heather behind you. You turn the turf in your hands, grass side down, and place it at the end of the row, aligning it carefully with its neighbors, leaving that same gap of a few inches between them, so that the wind can pass freely across every cut surface, and you note with a quiet, detached satisfaction that the row is now longer than your own height, and growing with every trip. You straighten up and pause for a moment, feeling the faint ache that has begun to settle into your lower back and the muscles across your shoulders. Not a sharp pain, but a dull, warm fatigue that comes from repeating the same motion many times, and you roll your shoulders once, slowly, before walking back to the cut face. The bog around you has not changed. The sky remains that even, soft grey. The wind blows steadily from the southwest. The bog cotton nods and sways, and the distant curlew calls at long, irregular intervals, its voice the only sound besides the wet sigh of the spade and the soft thump of each turf landing on the heather. You make another cut, and another, and another, and the sequence begins to settle into a rhythm so steady and predictable that it seems to measure time itself. Each cycle of press, lever, lift, carry, turn, place, return marking a small unhurried unit of the morning. The spade sinks, you lean back, the turf rises, you walk, you set it down, you go back, and the motion flows from one stage to the next without a break, your body moving through it with the smooth, economical grace of long practice. Your mind, freed from the need to direct each action, drifts outward to the wider landscape, noticing the subtle changes that occur so slowly they might not be changes at all. A slight brightening of the grey sky in the east, a momentary lull in the wind, a new patch of blue that appears and then vanishes behind the cloud cover. Before you can be sure it was there, the smell of cut peat grows stronger with every turf you extract, filling the air around the cut face with its sharp, clean, rooty scent, and you breathe it in deeply, finding it strangely refreshing despite its earthy heaviness, a smell that speaks of deep time and slow decay, and the patient, ongoing work of the bog. As you work your way further along the cut face, you begin to notice small variations in the peat itself, differences that you would not have observed without the close attention that the rhythm allows. In one section, the peat is darker and wetter, so saturated that water drips from the blade as you lift each turf, the drops falling back into the trough with small, soft splashes that catch the light for an instant before vanishing into the dark surface. In another section, the peat is lighter and more fibrous, threaded through with pale strands of undecomposed sphagnum and the thin white roots of bog cotton, and these turves are slightly easier to cut because the fibers part more readily under the sharp edge of the blade. You handle each variation without comment, adjusting the angle of the spade or the depth of your cut by tiny, instinctive amounts that your hands know without being told, and the turves continue to fall away from the face in a steady, unbroken succession, each one slightly different from the last, but all sharing the same rectangular shape, the same dense weight, the same gold-wet surface that glistens in the grey light. The row of cut turves behind you has now grown long enough that you can no longer see its end without turning your head. A long, dark column of rectangular blocks lying flat on the heather, like a path laid out across the bog. And you pause in the work to look back at it, resting your hands on the handle of the spade and letting your breathing slow. The line is straight and orderly, each turf aligned with its neighbours, the gaps between them even and regular, and you feel a quiet, steady satisfaction at the sight, not a prideful feeling, but a simple, calm acknowledgement that the work is progressing as it should, that the morning has not been wasted. The turves you cut first, the ones that have been lying in the open air the longest, are already beginning to change, their cut surfaces losing the high, wet gloss of saturation and taking on a duller, darker finish, and their edges are just starting to firm up, becoming less sticky to the touch as the wind draws the surface moisture away. You walk over to them and crouch down, pressing your thumb gently against the cut face of the earliest turf, and you feel that it is still soft and yielding, but no longer dripping. The first stage of the long, slow drying that will transform these heavy, wet blocks into light, crumbly pieces of fuel. The scent of this turf is different too, less sharp and acidic, more muted and earthy, as if the first volatile notes have already blown away on the morning breeze. You return to the cut face and resume the rhythm, stepping down into the trough again and positioning the spade at the fresh end of the wall where the peat is still untouched. The trough is deeper now, the cut face rising to the height of your knees, and you must bend slightly more to reach the bottom of each cut, your body adjusting to the changing geometry of the work without conscious direction. The extra depth means that each turf is slightly heavier, because the peat lower down is more compacted and holds more water, and you feel the added weight in your forearms and across your shoulders as you lift each block onto the blade and carry it to the row, but you do not mind the extra effort. It is simply part of the day's work, a small, incremental demand that your body meets without complaint. Your breathing settles into a slower, deeper pattern that matches the rhythm of the cuts, each inhale coming as you press the spade down, each exhale as you lift the turf free, and the sensation is calming, almost meditative, a union of breath and motion that leaves no room for stray thoughts or worries. The morning continues to pass in this slow, steady way, the sun climbing unseen behind the grey overcast and the quality of the light shifting from the pale silver tone of early day to a warmer, milkier brightness that softens every contour of the bog. You pause only once to take a drink of water from the leather bottle, the liquid cool and faintly tasting of the leather itself, and you wipe your mouth with the back of your hand before returning the bottle to its place on the higher ground. The brief pause allows you to feel the wind more fully, a steady, cool flow that dries the sweat on your forehead and neck and rustles the heather with a soft, continuous sound, like water running over stones. And you close your eyes for a moment and simply stand there, letting the wind move around you while you listen to the small, distant sounds of the bog. When you open your eyes again, the world looks exactly as it did before, but you feel slightly refreshed, as if the wind has blown away some of the fatigue that was beginning to settle into your limbs, and you pick up the spade and return to the cut face with a renewed steadiness. The pile of fresh turves behind you has become a small landmark now, a dark, geometric shape on the otherwise formless expanse of the bog, and you notice that it is visible from a good distance, a clear sign of human labor in the midst of the wild, open land. Each new turf you add to the row is a small, incremental extension of that landmark, and you find yourself glancing back at it from time to time as you work, tracking its growth with the same quiet satisfaction that a farmer might feel watching a field fill with sheaves. The row has reached the point where the ground begins to rise slightly toward the higher, drier heather, and you know that soon you will need to start a second row or begin stacking the turves into small footings, but for now you simply continue the rhythm of cutting and carrying, one turf after another, as the morning rolls slowly on toward midday. The bog holds you in its stillness, the spade rises and falls in your hands, the wind blows steadily from the southwest, and the sky remains that soft, even grey, a dome of quiet light that watches over everything without comment. By the time you have cut a full score of turves, the wind has risen into a steady, mild flow that moves across the open land without obstruction, humming low over the heather and bending the bog cotton into dancing white arcs that nod and sway in unison like a field of tiny, silent bells. You pause in your cutting and straighten your back slowly, feeling each vertebra settle into place after the long forward bend, and you let the wind cool the dampness on your neck, a sensation that is at once gentle and bracing, like a cool cloth laid briefly against the skin. The spade remains in your hand, its tip resting on the peat, and you simply stand there for a while, your breathing deepening without conscious effort as the moving air fills your lungs with its clean, open taste. Around you, the bog seems to exhale in sympathy, the whole landscape stirring under the wind's steady pressure, and you notice how it draws the first moisture from the upturned turves so that their exposed surfaces begin to lose their glossy wetness and take on a matte, darker hue, the sheen fading from a wet shine to a dull, velvety finish that speaks of the first stage of drying. The sound of the wind as it passes over the bog is not a single noise, but a layered, continuous presence, like a distant, constant sea held in the grasses, a soft roar that never rises or falls but simply persists, filling every gap in the silence. Close to your ears, the wind makes a faint, whistling thread as it slips past the brim of your hat and the collar of your shirt, while further out, across the open stretches of heather, it produces a deeper, rustling murmur that blends with the drier rattle of last year's dead grasses still standing in scattered clumps. In the pools of dark bog water, the wind etches tiny, fleeting ripples that travel across the surface in shivering arcs, catching the grey light and then vanishing as quickly as they came, leaving the water momentarily still before the next gust touches it again. The reeds and rushes at the margins of these pools bend and straighten, their stems hissing softly against one another in a dry, papery whisper that adds yet another strand to the weave of sound, and you find yourself listening to all of it at once, not picking out individual threads, but letting the whole wash of noise settle over you like a second silence. The wind carries with it a mingling of scents, the clean, sharp, rooty smell of the freshly cut peat rising from the trough behind you, and combining with the drier, earthier scent of the higher pastures beyond the bog, where the grasses are already beginning to cure under the May sun. There is a faint, almost imperceptible saltiness in the air as well, a reminder that the sea lies somewhere to the west, beyond the low hills, and that this same wind has travelled across miles of open water before reaching this quiet, inland place. The combination is complex and shifting, each breath bringing a slightly different balance of smells, and you find yourself breathing more deeply, deliberately, as if you could taste the landscape on the air, could separate the layers of peat and grass and salt and the faint, sweet perfume of the tiny white flowers that grow low among the heather. The wind is never still, never the same from one moment to the next, and yet it is constant, a steady, ongoing presence that seems to hold the whole bog in a state of slow, patient motion. You turn your head slightly and watch how the wind works upon the line of cut turves behind you, the dark rectangles lying grass down on the heather and surrendering their moisture to the moving air in a process so gradual that you cannot see it happening, only infer it from the darkening of the cut surfaces and the way the uppermost edges have begun to firm and crust slightly. The wind plays over each turf in turn, drawing the water from the exposed peat fibre by fibre, and you know that on a day like this, with a steady, mild flow and no rain, the surface drying will be well advanced by evening. The turves will be lighter to handle, less sticky to the touch, their pores open to the air like 1,000 tiny mouths drinking in the dry, cool breeze. You think about the weeks ahead, the repeated turnings and restackings, the slow march of the turves from wet, heavy blocks to light, brittle cakes that will burn with a steady, smokeless flame, and you understand that the wind is the true agent of this transformation, the unseen partner in the work that does its own slow task while you rest your arms or ply the spade. This pause you are taking now, standing still with the wind moving around you, is not idleness, but a necessary part of the drying itself, because the wind cannot be hurried, and to work when the wind works is enough. Small insects disturbed by your cutting or simply carried on the breeze rise from the exposed peat and are lifted away, drifting past you on invisible currents, their tiny wings catching the light for an instant before they vanish into the wider bog. A small dark beetle crawls across the cut face of a nearby turf, its legs moving with a slow, deliberate purpose, and you watch it for a moment before a stronger gust catches it and tumbles it gently into the heather, where it rights itself and continues on its way. This world of tiny, overlooked creatures is part of the wind's domain as well, the air full of minute travellers going about their unseen business. And you find yourself oddly comforted by the thought that you are not alone here, that the bog is alive with countless small lives, all moving to their own rhythms under the same grey sky. A lark begins to sing somewhere high above, its voice a thin, bright thread of sound that the wind tugs and scatters, so that the notes seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You tilt your head back and search the grey sky for the bird, but you cannot find it. It is lost in the vast, pale dome of cloud, a tiny speck of song suspended somewhere between earth and heaven. The lark's call rises and falls, short repeated phrases that tumble over one another in a cascade of liquid notes, and the wind seizes each phrase and pulls it apart, stretching the melody into a scattered, fragmented music that drifts down to you in snatches. You close your eyes and simply listen, letting the sound wash over you, and for a few moments there is nothing but the wind and the lark and the steady, slow beating of your own heart. When you open your eyes again, the clouds overhead have shifted slightly, a great, slow migration of grey masses moving from west to east in a stately, silent procession that seems to match the steadiness of the wind. The gaps between the clouds are thin and fleeting, but through one such gap a wash of pale, milky sunlight spills down onto a distant stretch of the bog, illuminating a patch of heather and a dark pool with a sudden, diffuse glow that lasts only a minute before the gap closes and the light is gone. The wind does not pause or alter its course. It continues its steady flow, carrying the memory of that brief brightness away across the ridge, and you watch the shadow of a cloud slide across the bog toward you, a dark, shapeless mass that moves over the heather like a slow, silent tide. When the shadow reaches you, the temperature drops by a slight, barely perceptible degree, a coolness that passes over your skin and then is gone, replaced by the steady, neutral cool of the wind, and you feel a small shiver travel down your spine before it fades. You take a few deliberate breaths of this moving air, feeling it fill your lungs with the same steadiness that moves the clouds and bends the bog cotton and ripples the dark pools, and you become aware of a deep, quiet alignment between your own breathing and the wind's unceasing flow. The wind does not hurry. It simply moves, always forward, always steady, and your own breath matches it without effort. Each inhale slow and deep, each exhale a soft release that is carried away into the larger breath of the bog. Your shoulders, which you did not realize were still holding a residue of tension, drop a little further, and your grip on the spade's handle loosens until you are simply resting your hand on the worn wood rather than holding it. The pause stretches on, a long, tranquil interlude in the middle of the working day, and you allow yourself to sink into it fully, not resisting the stillness that the wind itself seems to create. You open your eyes and look out across the bog to the distant low hills that rise in soft, rounded shapes against the grey horizon, their slopes a patchwork of darker and lighter greens where the fields and hedgerows mark the boundary between the wild ground and the farmed. A thin column of smoke arises from a chimney somewhere among those hills, a pale grey wisp that the wind bends almost horizontal before it dissolves into the sky, and you watch it for a long moment, thinking of the hearth it comes from and the people gathered there, their own day's work unfolding in parallel with yours. The smoke is a sign of human presence, but it is a quiet, distant sign, no louder than the lark's song, and it does not disturb the stillness. It simply adds another layer to the landscape, another small detail in the vast, slow-moving picture. The wind continues its work on the cut turves, and you notice now that the very first ones you laid down, the ones that have been exposed the longest, have developed a fine, almost invisible crust on their upward-facing surfaces, a delicate skin of drier peat that cracks slightly when you run a fingertip over it. This crust is the first tangible result of the drying, the outward sign that the moisture within is migrating slowly toward the surface to be carried away, and you feel a quiet sense of satisfaction at seeing it, a confirmation that the day's labor is already bearing its slow fruit. You kneel beside one of these early turves and pick it up, testing its weight with both hands, and you find that it is still heavy, but noticeably lighter than when you first cut it. The water loss perhaps a pound or two, the fibers beginning to shrink and tighten as they dry. You set it back down carefully, grass side down as before, and you adjust the gap between it and its neighbor to ensure that the wind can continue to pass freely between them, because even a small obstruction can slow the drying and lead to mold or rot. The wind shifts direction very slightly, veering a point or two toward the south, and you feel the change as a subtle alteration in the pressure on your face, the cool touch moving from your left cheek to a more frontal position. This shift is normal, part of the wind's natural variation, and you note it without concern, turning your body slightly to face it so that you can continue to breathe it in directly. The new angle brings a slightly different scent, one that has less of the sea in it and more of the dry, warm smell of the inland pastures, a scent of grass and clover and the faint, sweet dust of new growth. And you welcome it as you would welcome a visitor who brings news of other places. The bog cotton, responding to the new angle, bows in a slightly different direction, its white heads now pointing more toward the east than the north, and the ripples on the dark pool realign themselves, their arcs shifting into a new pattern that crisscrosses the water in a different geometry. A pair of curlews flies overhead, their long curved beaks and mottled brown plumage clear against the grey sky, and they call to each other with those same haunting, piping notes that you have heard all morning, their voices carrying over the wind and fading into the distance as they head toward the wetter ground to the west. You watch them until they are small, dark specks that merge with the horizon, and then you lower your gaze back to the bog, to the heather and the pools and the long dark line of turves that marks your morning's work. The wind is still blowing, steady and mild, and the lark is still singing somewhere above, and the clouds continue their slow, silent drift from west to east and nothing has changed and everything has changed, because the turves are a little drier than they were an hour ago, and the day is moving on in its quiet, inevitable way, and you are simply here, standing on the bog with the wind in your face and the spade in your hand, a part of it all. With the cutting now paused and a sufficient number of turves lying grass down on the heather, you turn your attention to the next stage of the work, the careful, patient task of building the small footings that will hold the turves upright and open to the wind so that every side may dry evenly in the steady May air. You set the wing-spade aside on a dry patch of higher ground, its blade resting flat and the handle angled up so that you can find it easily later, and you walk slowly toward the first turf in the long row, the one you cut at the very start of the morning and which has already begun to lose its surface gloss. Bending from the knees, you take hold of it with both hands, one on each end, and you lift it from the heather, feeling its weight and the way the damp, fibrous block presses cool against your palms through the dark stains that have long since become a second skin. The turf is still heavy but no longer dripping. Its cut surface is now a deep, matte brown, and as you carry it a few steps to the chosen spot on higher, drier ground where the heather is short and firm, you notice the faint, earthy smell that rises from it, quieter now than when it was first sliced from the bog. You set the turf down on its end, the grass-covered face turned inward and the cut faces outward, and you hold it upright with one hand while you reach for a second turf with the other. The second turf is placed beside the first, leaning slightly against it at the top so that the two form a narrow inverted V, their upper edges touching and their lower edges spread apart by the width of your hand, creating a small open tunnel through which the wind can pass freely. You adjust the angle of each turf with a gentle push of your fingertips, feeling the rough drying surface catch slightly on your skin, and you make sure that both blocks are stable, their bases pressed firmly into the short heather so that no wobble betrays an insecure footing. The structure, small and simple, already stands as a tiny triangular shape against the wide, flat backdrop of the bog, its dark color contrasting with the pale greens and browns of the vegetation. You return to the row of cut turves for a third block, lifting it carefully and carrying it back to the growing footing, and you position it against one side of the existing pair, leaning it inward so that its top edge rests against the meeting point of the first two, while its bottom edge extends outward, forming a third leg of what will become a small pyramid. The geometry is not precise, not measured with any tool, but your eye and your hands know the right angles from long practice, and the turf settles into place with a soft, gritty sound as its cut face scrapes gently against its neighbor. You press down lightly on the top of the assembly, testing its stability, and you feel the three turves lock together, each supporting the others, their combined weight and friction holding the whole structure in a delicate but secure balance. The wind, still steady from the southwest, threads through the gaps between the turves with a faint, hollow whisper, and you note with satisfaction that the air can reach every cut surface, the inner faces as well as the outer, an arrangement that will draw moisture evenly from all sides over the coming days. You step back and look at the small footing, this first tentative construction that stands no higher than your knee, and you see how its shape, a rough tripod of dark blocks, resembles the miniature dwellings of some ancient, forgotten people, a tiny shelter raised against the elements on the open bog. The thought passes without weight, a drifting fancy that comes and goes while you turn back to the row of turves, and you gather three more blocks, one after another, carrying each to a new spot a few paces from the first footing, where you will build a second, identical structure. The process repeats itself with the same slow, deliberate care, the first turf set on its end, the second leaning against it, the third completing the tripod, each adjustment made with the light touch of your fingertips, each check of stability performed with the same gentle downward press on the apex. The second footing takes shape beside the first, its dark angled faces catching the diffuse grey light, and you begin to see the pattern that will spread across this higher ground. A cluster of small dark pyramids standing in loose formation like a herd of quiet, patient animals. You work your way along the row of cut turves, gathering them in groups of three, carrying them to the rising stretch of heather, and building footing after footing with a rhythm that is slower than the cutting but no less steady. A rhythm of bending, lifting, carrying, placing, and adjusting that occupies your whole body without straining it. The turves feel different in your hands now, than they did when first cut. Their surfaces had begun to crust lightly, the outermost fibers drying into a thin, brittle skin that crumbles very slightly when gripped too tightly, while the interiors remain cool and damp, dense with the water that will take many days of wind and sun to release. You handle each block with the appropriate care, not squeezing too hard, not letting it drop, and you settle it into its footing with the same quiet attention you would give to placing a stone in a wall or a sheaf on a cart, an attention that is not tense, but simply complete, absorbing your whole awareness for as long as the task requires. As the number of footings grows, you pause between constructions to walk among them, checking that the gaps between the turves are even and wide enough to admit the breeze, that no block is touching wet ground where moisture could seep back in, and that the structures stand upright without leaning or twisting. You find one footing where the third turf has slipped slightly outward, its base sliding on a patch of smooth, damp moss, and you crouch down to reset it, lifting the turf clear, scraping the moss away with the side of your boot until the firmer, drier heather is exposed, and then repositioning the block with a careful two-handed placement that leaves it solid and secure. The wind hums past your ears as you work, steady and unchanging, and the sound of it moving through the footings is slightly different from the sound it made over the open heather. A subtle shifting of the airflow that produces small, breathy notes and a gentle, irregular susurrus. You stand still for a moment and listen, your hands resting on your hips, and the music of the wind through the stacks is a quiet, uncomposed thing, a lullaby of air and peat that no one else will ever hear. The higher ground where you are building the footings is slightly drier than the bog floor, its heather shorter and sparser, and underfoot the soil is firmer, with more sand and less peat. A good foundation for the stacks because it drains the rainwater away quickly and does not hold the damp against the bottom edges of the turves. You notice small details of this ground as you walk back and forth. The tiny white flowers of the bedstraw growing low among the heather, their four-petaled stars just beginning to open to the grey light. The scattered, bleached shells of tiny snails, empty and fragile, that crackle under your boot with a sound like thin ice breaking. The single, wind-bent stalk of last year's thistles, its brown head empty of seed and its spines softened by a winter of rain. These things are not important, not part of the work, but they are part of the place, and your awareness of them is a slow, peripheral noticing that requires no effort, the kind of attention that comes when the body is busy and the mind is still. You finish the turves from the first section of the row and walk back to the cut face to survey the remaining blocks, the ones you cut more recently and which are still heavier and wetter than their older companions. These fresher turves need a little more time lying flat before they can be stacked, because their surfaces are too soft and the peat too sticky to hold a shape under its own weight, and stacking them too soon would cause them to slump and close the air gaps, slowing the drying and risking spoilage. You decide to leave them where they lie for now, flat on the heather with their cut faces to the wind, and you return your attention to the footings already built, counting them silently as you walk among them. 1, 2, 3, 4, a small village of dark pyramids that stands in the midst of the bog like a temporary settlement. The number is not large, a dozen footings perhaps, each holding 3 turves. But the work has taken time because each placement was deliberate, each adjustment made with care, and you feel a quiet, settled satisfaction at the sight of them all standing together, their angled forms repeating across the higher ground in a pattern that is both orderly and organic. You take a drink of water from the leather bottle, the liquid still cool from the morning, and you sit down for a moment on a dry hummock of heather, your back straight and your hands resting on your knees. From this low seat, the footings appear larger, their triangular shapes silhouetted against the grey sky, and you watch the wind move through them, stirring the bog cotton that grows between the stacks and sending small, dry particles of peat dust swirling up from the cut faces. The dust hangs in the air for a moment, a fine brown haze, and then the wind carries it away over the bog, scattering it into the wider landscape where it will settle on other heather, other pools, other footings yet to be built. You think about the weeks ahead, the repeated turnings and restackings, the slow migration of moisture from the core of each turf to its surface. And you understand that this small, temporary village is only the first of many that you will build before the summer is out. each one a station on the long journey from wet peat to dry fuel. A meadow pea pit flits down from the sky and lands on top of one of the footings, its small brown body perched lightly on the junction of the three turves, and it cocks its head and looks around with quick, jerky movements before launching itself back into the air and flying off toward the distant ridge. The footing does not shift or tremble. It holds its shape under the tiny weight, and you feel a small, irrational pride in the solidity of your work, a craftsman's quiet pleasure in a thing well made, even if the thing is only a stack of drying peat that will be taken apart again in a few days. You rise from your seat, brushing the dry heather from your breeches, and you walk to the next patch of turves that are ready to be stacked, the ones that have lain long enough in the open air to firm up and lose their surface stickiness. These you will build into a second cluster of footings, extending the small village across the higher ground until the whole day's cut stands upright and open to the wind. You take the first of these turves in your hands and carry it to a new spot, a few paces beyond the existing footings, where the ground rises very slightly and the drainage is good, and you set it on its end with the same careful motion you have used all morning. The work continues in this way, a slow, methodical progression that moves from the cut face to the row to the footing, from the bog floor to the higher ground, from the wet, heavy block to the standing, drying stack, and the morning slides imperceptibly toward midday, while the wind blows and the lark sings and the grey sky holds its soft, even light over everything. Your hands, stained dark with peat, move through the familiar motions without hurry or hesitation, and the footings multiply behind you, a quiet, growing testament to the slow, patient labor that fills the hours with calm, purposeful stillness. You settle onto a patch of dry heather, choosing a spot where the ground rises just enough to offer a low, rounded seat above the wetter bog floor, and you lower yourself slowly, feeling the slight give of the wiry stems beneath your weight as they compress into a rough, springy cushion. The leather bottle of water is in your hand, its surface cool and dark and faintly greasy from long handling, and you set it beside you on the heather, pressing it down so that it will not roll away. Beside it, you place the small linen-wrapped parcel of bread that you carried from the farmstead in the early dark of the morning. Your shoulders, which you did not realize was still held high and tight from the steady rhythm of cutting and stacking, drop by slow degrees as the tension of the morning's labor begins to ease out of them. A softening that starts at the base of your neck and travels downward through your spine until you are sitting with a kind of loose, heavy stillness. The world around you seems to draw a long, slow breath and then hold it, the wind easing from its steady, pushing flow into a gentler drift that barely stirs the bog cotton and makes only the faintest sigh as it passes over the heather, a sound like a sleeper exhaling in the next room. The clouds overhead, which all morning have been a single, unbroken sheet of grey, now begin to thin in places, parting not with a dramatic break, but with a gradual, gentle dissolution that lets a wash of pale, milky sunlight spill slowly down onto the bog. The light is diffuse and shadowless, so soft that it seems to come from no particular direction, filling the air with a warm, silvery glow that touches everything equally. The dark pools, the nodding white heads of the bog cotton, the low green-grey heather, and the small dark pyramids of the bog cotton, the low green-grey heather, and the small dark pyramids of the footings, standing in their quiet cluster on the higher ground. Nothing casts a shadow. The world is lit as if from within, each object holding its own gentle radiance, and the effect is one of deep, enveloping calm, a midday hush that slows your thoughts to the pace of the light itself. You watch the transformation without comment, your hands resting loosely on your knees, and you feel the slight cool dampness of your breeches of the knees where you knelt in the wet peat earlier, a dampness that is slowly warming now in the mild air. You unwrap the bread from its linen cloth, folding the fabric back in careful, unhurried movements, and the bread inside is a small, dense loaf of dark barley, its crust firm and its crumb close-textured, still faintly warm from the morning's baking, even though hours have passed. You break off a piece with your fingers, the crust cracking slightly and scattering a few small crumbs onto your lap, and you lift it to your mouth and begin to chew slowly, each bite worked with a patience that matches the stillness of the bog. The bread has a nutty, earthy taste, slightly sour from the buttermilk in the dough, and you eat it without hurry, pausing between mouthfuls to breathe the cool air and to look out across the wide, open landscape that stretches away on all sides. Beside you, the leather bottle waits, and after a few bites, you pick it up. Work the stopper free with a twist of your thumb and forefinger, and take a long, slow drink of the water. The water is still cool, not cold, but fresh, and it tastes very slightly of the leather itself, a clean, faintly smoky taste that is not unpleasant, but simply familiar, part of the day and the place and the work. The slight ache in your muscles makes itself known now that you have stopped moving, a dull, warm tightness across your shoulders where the lifting and carrying told, a softer ache in the small of your back from the repeated bending, and a general diffuse fatigue in your forearms and hands that comes from gripping the spade and handling the heavy, wet turves for so many hours. The ache is not pain, not something to be avoided or cured, but rather a quiet companion to the rest, a physical reminder of the morning's effort that is almost pleasant in its steadiness, like the memory of work still singing in the fibers of your body. You rub your palms slowly against your thighs, feeling the rough, drying peat stains on your skin, and the way the fingertips are slightly tender from contact with the gritty peat and the cold iron, and then you let your hands fall still again, resting them palm up on your knees in a posture of simple, open quiet. Now that you are still and no longer focused on the task, you begin to notice the small details of the bog that escaped your attention while you were working, the tiny, intricate world that exists at the level of your feet and knees. In the wetter hollows, where the water stands just below the surface, cushions of star-shaped moss grow in dense, pale green mounds, each tiny plant a perfect miniature rosette of pointed leaves that glisten with trapped droplets of moisture. The moss is soft and cool to the touch, as you discovered when your fingers brushed against it during the clearing, and it grows in such close, compact clusters that it looks like a single, continuous carpet, its surface unbroken except where a small insect has left a faint trail. You notice the different kinds of moss now. The pale, almost white sphagnum that holds water like a sponge and feels squelchy underfoot, and the darker, richer green of the hair-cap moss that grows on the slightly drier hummocks, its tiny, hairy caps nodding on thin stems. These mosses have been growing here for decades, perhaps centuries, building the peat layer by slow, incremental accumulation, and you are sitting on the product of their patient, silent work. Near a dark pool a few paces to your left, the water that has seeped into an old abandoned peat cutting gleams with a dark polished shine, its surface so still that it reflects the grey and milky sky with a perfect, mirror-like clarity. The old cutting is deeper than the trough you have dug today, its edges softened and rounded by years of rain and wind, and the water within it is the colour of strong tea, clear but deeply stained by the tannins that leach from the surrounding peat. A thin film of dust and pollen floats on the surface, barely visible unless you look closely, and along the margins a few waterboatmen skate in tiny, jerking movements, their long, thin legs dimpling the surface tension without breaking it. You watch one of these small insects as it moves across the pool, its path a series of quick, erratic dashes interspersed with long, drifting pauses, and you follow its progress without thought, simply observing the tiny, self-contained life of the water. A single dragonfly hovers into view, its body a thin, iridescent needle of blue and green, its forewings moving so fast that they are only a blur, a dry, rattling hum filling the air around it. It hangs motionless for a moment, a few feet above the dark pool, its huge compound eyes catching the light in a brief metallic flash, and then it darts sideways with a sudden sharp zip, its wings clattering against a stem of rush before it veers away and vanishes over the heather. The sound of its flight fades quickly, leaving behind only the soft hum of the wind and the distant, scattered calls of birds, and you realize that you had been holding your breath without knowing it. So absorbed were you in the tiny drama. The bog is full of these small, fleeting events, these brief appearances and disappearances that would go entirely unnoticed if you were working. And now that you are sitting still, they present themselves to you one after another, a quiet procession of small lives lived in the wide, empty space. You listen to the silence that is not really silence, the quiet that is made of many tiny, distant sounds all woven together into a single, steady fabric. Somewhere far off, beyond the low ridge to the east, a crow calls 3 times with a harsh, cawing voice that echoes briefly and then fades, leaving a small ragged hole in the stillness that quickly closes over. Closer, in the heather just a few yards away, a meadow peepit sings its thin, repetitive song, a series of high, piping notes that rise and fall in a simple, unvarying phrase, and the sound is so constant that it almost becomes part of the silence itself. A thin thread of melody sewn through the deeper hum of the wind. The wind, though softer now, still produces its long, low sigh as it passes over the open ground, and it stirs the heather with a sound like water running quietly over smooth stones. A sound that has no beginning and no end, but simply continues. A gentle, ongoing note that underlies everything else. And very close, right at your own body, you can hear the gentle creak of your leather belt as your chest rises and falls with each slow breath. A tiny, intimate sound that reminds you of your own presence, your own place in this vast, quiet world. The light moves almost imperceptibly as you sit there, the pale, milky wash of sunshine shifting across the bog by degrees so small that you cannot see them happening, only realize after the fact that the illuminated patch on the distant heather is now in a slightly different place. The clouds continue their slow, silent migration from west to east, great formless masses of grey and white that merge and divide and merge again, their edges soft and blurry, their progress so gradual that they seem to hang motionless even as they change. You watch one particular cloud, a large, gently rounded shape that reminds you of a slow-moving animal, as it drifts across the sky and finally obscures the sun again, returning the bog to its earlier, cooler greyness and erasing the faint, diffuse shadows that had begun to form. The temperature drops by a degree, just enough to notice, and you feel a small shiver travel across your forearms before it passes, leaving the air as mild and steady as before. The sense of time itself seems to stretch and slow in the midday hush, each minute expanding to fill a larger space, and you find that you have no clear idea of how long you have been sitting here. It might be 10 minutes, or 20, or a full hour. The light has not changed enough to tell, and the sun is hidden behind the clouds, so that its position is only a guess, a pale brightening in one part of the sky that could be anywhere from late morning to early afternoon. This absence of measured time is not unsettling, but deeply restful, a release from the quiet pressure of the day's schedule, and you allow yourself to sink into it willingly, to let the minutes flow past without counting them, like watching a slow, peaceful river from the bank. The bread in your hand is half eaten, and you take another bite now, chewing it with the same slow, patient rhythm, tasting the barley and the faint salt and the clean, honest flavor of simple food made without hurry. As you eat, you let your eyes wander across the bog to the distant low hills that rise in soft, rounded shapes against the grey horizon, and you notice that the farmstead you saw earlier, the one with the thin column of smoke, is now just barely visible as a small dark cluster of buildings tucked into a fold of the hillside. The smoke has stopped rising, or perhaps the fire has burned low, and the buildings look very small and very far away, like a child's toy left on a green slope. Between here and there lies the whole wide expanse of the bog, mile after mile of heather and pool and bog cotton, and you think about the distance, the slow walk you will make at dusk, when the work is done and the light fails and the curlews fly low over the darkening ground. The thought does not hurry you. It is simply a quiet acknowledgement that this rest will end, that the work will resume, that the day will move on, but for now, here is this moment, this pause, this small meal in the middle of the ancient breathing bog. You notice a flicker of white at the edge of your vision, and you turn your head very slowly to see a single white butterfly, a small, delicate thing with wings, the color of cream, tracing an aimless fluttering path above the cut peat of the trough. Its flight is erratic, a series of dips and rises and sudden, sideways darts as if it is being blown by tiny local gusts that you cannot feel, and it hovers for a moment over a freshly cut turf before drifting away toward the dark pool. You follow it with your gaze, watching its pale wings flash against the browns and greens of the bog, and it disappears into a patch of brighter light near the water's edge, swallowed by the glare, before reappearing a moment later and continuing its wandering path. The butterfly has no purpose that you can discern, no destination, no urgency, and its presence feels like a small gift, a quiet visitation from the wider world of living. Moving things that shares this ancient place with you. You finish the last of the bread, brushing the crumbs from your lap with a sweep of your hand, and you take another long drink from the leather bottle, draining it by half before stopping it and setting it aside once more. Your stomach feels warm and full, the simple meal settling with a comfortable weight, and the ache in your muscles has softened further, replaced by a pleasant, heavy stillness that makes no demands. You lean back slightly, supporting yourself with your hands on the heather behind you, and you tilt your head up to look at the sky, at the vast grey dome that arches over everything, at the slow, silent clouds moving in their endless, patient drift. The sky looks exactly as it has looked over this bog for hundreds of Mays before you. The same soft grey, the same diffuse light, the same clouds sailing from the west, and it will look exactly the same for hundreds of Mays after you are gone, and your spade is rusted, and the footings you built today have long since been burned to ash and scattered on the wind. The thought is not sad, but deeply comforting, a sense of your own small place in a long, unbroken line of cutters who have sat on this same heather at midday, eaten their bread, and listened to the same wind humming over the same pools. The silence deepens again as the wind drops to a barely perceptible drift, and for a few moments the bog is as still as a held breath. The heather motionless, the pools glassy, the bog cotton hanging limp on its stems. The lark has stopped singing, the crow has fallen silent, and even the meadow pipit has paused its thin, repetitive call. The whole world is quiet, a profound, absorbing quiet that seems to press gently on your ears until you can hear the soft, internal sounds of your own body, the slow thud of your heart, the faint rush of blood in your temples, the steady sigh of your breathing. You close your eyes and let the quiet wash over you, a tide of stillness that rises and holds, and then, slowly, very slowly, recedes as the wind returns, a faint breath at first and then a steadier flow, rustling the heather and setting the bog cotton nodding once more. You open your eyes and sit up a little straighter, your hands returning to your knees, and you look out across the bog to check the footings, the small dark pyramids standing in their cluster on the higher ground. They have not moved, of course. They are as solid as when you left them, their cut faces drying in the wind, and you can see the slight, dusty bloom on the exposed surfaces that tells you the drying is progressing well. The rest has done its work, easing the fatigue from your limbs and quieting your mind, and you feel a slow, steady readiness beginning to stir. Not an urgency, but a quiet willingness to return to the labor, to pick up the wing-spade and resume the rhythm of the afternoon. For now, though, you remain seated a moment longer, watching the butterfly complete its wandering circuit and drift away over the heather, watching the clouds continue their silent march, and feeling the deep, abiding peace of the bog at midday settle around you like a cloak. You rise from your rest on the patch of dry heather, your body moving slowly after the long stillness, and you feel the slight stiffness that has settled into your knees and hips during the pause, a gentle, dull resistance that loosens as you stand and shift your weight from one foot to the other. The leather bottle and the linen cloth that wrapped your bread are gathered up with unhurried hands, the bottle returned to its place on your belt, and the cloth folded in a few simple motions before being tucked away, and you stand for a moment longer, looking out across the bog that has not changed in its essentials while you sat. The grey sky still soft and even overhead, the wind still blowing its steady course from the southwest, the bog cotton still bowing and rising in its patient. But the light has shifted, you notice, the pale, milky brightness of midday deepening by a single, subtle shade toward a warmer tone, the grey of the clouds now touched with the faintest hint of amber, where the sun, invisible behind the overcast, has begun its slow descent toward the western hills. The afternoon has arrived without announcement, as afternoons do, and with it comes the quiet call to return to the cut face and resume the work that the morning began. You walk back toward the trough where the wing-spade still stands, its blade resting flat on the peat and its handle angled upward at the same slight tilt you left it, and the sight of it waiting there is a small steady comfort, a tool that has not moved or changed or forgotten its purpose in your absence. You pick it up with both hands, the right finding the worn curve of the handle's top, and the left closing around the smooth shaft lower down, and you feel the familiar weight of it settle into your grip, the iron blade cold against the afternoon air, the wood still carrying the faint, oily warmth of your earlier handling. The trough lies before you, its dark, wet floor glistening softly in the changed light, its walls still straight and square where the wing cut them, and you step down into it carefully, your boots sinking slightly into the soft, saturated peat at the bottom, and the water seeping up around the leather with a cold, familiar touch. The cut face rises in front of you now at the height of your shins, a vertical wall of dense, fibrous peat that is slightly darker than it was in the morning because the surface moisture has had time to seep outward from the deeper layers, and you position the spade at the far end of the wall where the peat is still untouched and the corner is sharp and clean. The blade sinks in with that same low, wet sigh that you have heard so many times today, but the sound is subtly different in the warmer afternoon air, a little softer, a little less crisp, as if the peat itself has relaxed under the influence of the day's slow warmth. You press down with your foot on the blade's shoulder, transferring your weight smoothly from your back leg to your front, and the spade slides through the dense, fibrous layers with a slightly easier motion than it did in the chill of the early morning, the peat yielding just a little more readily now that the sun, even hidden behind clouds, has taken the cold edge off the surface. The wing slices the vertical face cleanly, separating the rectangular block from the mass of the bog, and you pull back on the handle with a slow, steady pressure that levers the turf free with a soft, sucking release, the bottom face tearing from the deeper layers with a sound that is by now as familiar as your own breathing. The turf comes away onto the blade, heavy and wet and dark, and you carry it the few steps to the end of the row that has grown long across the heather during the morning, adding it to the line of dark rectangles that wait to be stacked. The rhythm of the afternoon cutting settles over you more slowly than it did in the morning, not because you are tired, but because the day has moved past its midpoint and your body has entered a different phase of energy, a quieter, heavier steadiness that comes after food and rest and the long hours of work already done. Your movements are the same as they were this morning: press, lever, lift, carry, turn, place, return. But each one takes a fraction of a second longer, the pauses between actions stretching by a breath or two, and you do not resist this slowing because it feels natural, a matching of your pace to the afternoon's own gradual, unhurried unfolding. The spade rises and falls in your hands with a rhythm that is closer to a slow walk than a march. Each cut a deliberate, measured act that occupies its own small pocket of time without reference to the ones before or after. And you find that this slower pace allows you to notice more, the way the light falls on the cut face, the subtle variations in the peat's color and texture, the small sounds of the bob that continue around you, like a quiet, ongoing conversation. The peat itself feels slightly different now, in the warmer part of the day, because the sun, even behind the grey overcast, has been working on the surface layers for hours, warming the dark ground by a few degrees and taking the chill from the water that saturates every fibre. The wet blocks come away a little more easily than they did in the early morning, their bottom faces releasing with a slightly softer pull, and the cut surfaces glisten with a brighter, wetter sheen that catches the diffuse afternoon light in tiny, sparkling points. You notice that the peat here, deeper into the cut face, is darker and more compacted than the upper layers you worked this morning, the fibers finer and more densely packed, the water content slightly higher, because this deeper peat has never been exposed to the air or the sun in all the centuries of its formation. The turves from this depth are heavier, their weight a solid, sodden mass that pulls on your forearms as you lift them, and you adjust your grip on the handle slightly, moving your left hand a little higher on the shaft to give yourself more leverage, an adjustment that your body makes without conscious thought because it has done this work so many times before. You carry each wet, heavy block to the row on the heather, turning it grass-side down and placing it carefully beside its neighbors with that same gap of a few inches that allows the wind to pass through. And you watch the row grow by slow, steady increments, one turf at a time, as the afternoon moves forward. The light continues its gradual, almost imperceptible shift, the grey of the sky warming through a dozen subtle shades toward a muted golden grey that speaks of the sun's slow descent, and the shadows which were absent all morning begin to make their first faint appearance, a soft, blurry darkness beneath each footing on the higher ground, a slightly deeper tone in the hollows and dips of the bog, a thin, dark line along the eastern edge of the trough where the cut face blocks the low-angled light. These shadows are not sharp or dramatic. only the gentlest suggestion of contrast, but they give the landscape a new depth, a soft, three-dimensional quality that the flat, shadowless light of morning did not possess, and you find yourself pausing between cuts to look at the way the light models the shapes of the footings and the curves of the heather. The bog around you has grown a little more active as the afternoon has warmed the air, the small hidden life of the place stirring from its midday stillness and resuming its quiet business. A pair of meadow peepits flits low over the heather, their small brown bodies darting and swooping in quick, jerky flight, and one of them lands on a footing not far from where you stand, perching on the apex of the dark pyramid, with its tail bobbing up and down in a rapid, nervous motion, before it launches itself back into the air and follows its companion toward the distant ridge. A cloud of tiny midges hovers over the dark pool near the cut face, their minute bodies catching the light in a fine, dancing haze, and a single dragonfly, larger and bluer than the one you saw at midday, cuts through the swarm in a swift, direct flight, its wings making that same dry, clattering sound as it passes. You straighten up and watch it for a moment, the spade resting idle in your hands, and you feel the sweat cooling on your forehead as the steady wind moves over your skin, a sensation that is pleasant and grounding, a small reminder of your own body's warmth in the cool, open air. You return to the work, stepping down into the trough again and positioning the spade at the fresh end of the cut face, and you notice that the trough is now significantly deeper than it was in the morning, the floor a good handspan lower than the surrounding bog and the cut face rising to just below your knees. The extra depth means that you must bend slightly more to reach the bottom of each cut, your back curving into a deeper angle that you feel in the muscles along your spine, and you adjust your stance by spreading your feet a little wider and bending your knees more, lowering your center of gravity so that the work remains comfortable and balanced. The water that seeps into the trough from the surrounding peat is deeper now, pooling around your boots in a dark, cold sheet that ripples with each step you take, and you feel it soaking through the leather, a cold, wet pressure against your feet that you have learned to ignore over many seasons of this labor. The cold is not painful, only present, a steady, numbing cool that reminds you of the bog's depth and age, the thousands of years of water that lie beneath your feet in the dark, slowly compacting layers. You cut another turf, and another, the rhythm slow and steady, and the pile of fresh wet blocks behind you grows while the cut face recedes incrementally into the bog, the trough lengthening and deepening with each extraction. Between cuts, you pause to look out across the bog to the higher ground where the footings stand, the small dark pyramids that you built before the midday rest, and you note that their upper surfaces are now distinctly lighter in color than their bases, a clear sign that the drying is progressing from the top down as the wind draws the moisture upward and away. The footings look solid and stable, their triangular shapes repeated across the heather in a pattern that pleases the eye with its quiet order, and you feel a small, calm satisfaction at the sight, knowing that the morning's work has been well done and that the afternoon's cutting will add more turves to this small temporary village on the bog. A small brown bird that you cannot name flits down and lands on one of the newer turves, pecking at the cut surface with quick, darting movements of its beak as if searching for insects or seeds that might be trapped in the wet peat. You pause and watch it, the spade held still in your hands, and the bird continues its examination for a few moments, hopping from one turf to the next, before it seems to decide that there is nothing here worth eating, and launches itself back into the air, flying low and fast toward the pool where the midges hover. The interruption is brief and insignificant, but it leaves behind a small, pleasant sense of sharing the bog with other living creatures, each of you going about your own quiet business under the same grey sky, and you return to the cutting with a mind that is slightly refreshed, slightly more attentive to the small details of the work. The afternoon wears on in this way, a slow, steady progression of cuts and carries, pauses and observations, the sun moving invisibly across the sky behind the clouds, and the light shifting by slow, incremental degrees from the pale gold of mid-afternoon to the deeper, richer amber of late day. The shadows grow longer and more distinct, the soft, blurry darkness beneath each footing stretching eastward across the heather in thin, dark fingers, and the pools of dark water catch the angled light and glint with a warmer, bronze tone that was absent in the silver grey of morning. You find yourself working more slowly now, not from fatigue, but from a kind of settled, heavy calm that the late afternoon brings, a sense that the day's urgent business is done, and what remains is simply the completion of a rhythm already established, the finishing of a line already begun. You cut fewer turves in the afternoon than you did in the morning, but each one is a calm, measured act, a small, deliberate contribution to the pile that will fuel the winter fires, and you do not count them or hurry toward any particular number. You simply continue, one turf at a time, as the light deepens and the wind holds its steady course. You pause and set the spade aside, stepping out of the trough to take a drink of water and to stretch your back, and you walk a short distance across the heather to the edge of the higher ground where the footings stand. The view from here is slightly different, a little more elevated, and you can see the whole day's work laid out before you, the long, dark trough cutting through the bog, the row of fresh turves lying flat on the heather, the cluster of footings standing in their orderly triangles, and beyond them the wide, empty expanse of the bog, stretching away to the distant low hills that are now touched with the first faint haze of dusk. The farmstead is still there, its buildings a little clearer now in the angled light, and you see that a thin column of smoke has risen again from the chimney, a pale grey wisp that climbs straight up in the steady air and then bends eastward as it reaches the higher currents. You watch it for a long moment, thinking of the hearth and the warmth and the people moving about their own afternoon tasks, and then you turn and walk back to the cut face, ready to continue the slow, patient work that will fill the remaining hours of daylight. You pick up the wing-spade, feel its familiar weight settle into your hands, and step back down into the trough, the cold water closing around your boots as the blade sinks once more into the ancient, waiting peat. As the afternoon moves steadily toward evening, and the light takes on the deeper amber cast that signals the closing of the day, you set the wing-spade aside on the higher ground among the dry heather and turn your attention to the footings you built earlier, the small dark pyramids that have been standing in the wind since before your midday rest. The cutting is finished for now, the trough left behind in the bog with its floor dark and wet and its walls straight, and what remains is the careful, patient work of turning and restacking the turves that have already begun their long, slow drying under the steady May wind. You walk among the footings, your boots making soft brushing sounds in the heather, and you survey each little structure with the quiet, assessing gaze of someone who knows what to look for, the color of the peat, the texture of the cut faces, the way the wind has worked on the exposed surfaces throughout the hours since they were first stacked. The footings stand in their loose, orderly cluster, their triangular shapes dark against the graying light, and you note that the ones on the outer edge of the group, the ones that have caught the full force of the wind all day, look different from the ones nearer the center where the airflow was slightly less direct. You stop beside the first footing you built, the one that holds the earliest turves of the morning, and you lower yourself to one knee so that you can examine the blocks more closely, bringing your eyes level with the cut surfaces. The outward-facing sides, the ones that have been kissed by the steady southwest wind since the moment they were stacked, are now a noticeably lighter brown than they were this morning. The high, wet gloss of fresh peat replaced by a matte, almost dusty finish that speaks of surface moisture driven away into the moving air. You reach out and press your thumb gently against one of these windward faces, feeling the texture change under the slight pressure. The outermost layer gives just a little, then crumbles very slightly at the edges, the way a dry crust of earth crumbles when you touch it, and a few tiny dark grains fall away and scatter on the heather below. The interior of the turf, you can tell from the firmness beneath your thumb, is still damp and cool and dense, but the shell that the wind has built around it is dry and brittle, a protective skin that will gradually thicken as the days pass. You withdraw your hand and brush the dark crumbs from your fingertips, sniffing the air near the turf and catching the changed scent, a smell that has shifted from the sharp, acidic freshness of the morning's cut to something quieter and smokier, a muted, earthy fragrance that holds within it the distant promise of the winter fire. You rise and move around to the other side of the footing, the side facing east, and you kneel again to examine the inward-facing surfaces that have been shielded from the wind's full force by their neighbors and by their own position. These faces are still dark and cool to the touch, the color remaining the deep, wet brown of freshly cut peat, and when you press your thumb into them, the surface yields slightly, with a soft, damped give, leaving a shallow depression that fills slowly with a tiny bead of dark water. The contrast between the windward and the sheltered sides is the unmistakable sign that the drying is proceeding unevenly, as it always does in the first day, and that the time has come to turn each turf so that the still damp surfaces can face the moving air and begin their own journey toward dryness. This turning is a necessary step, a small, crucial intervention that keeps the drying even and prevents the inner cores from staying wet too long, which would lead to mold and rot and the slow dark decay that ruins good peat. You stand up, look at the footing one more time, and then you reach out and take hold of the first turf with both hands, your fingers wrapping around the ends of the block and your palms pressing against the roughened, drying surfaces. The turf lifts away from its companions with a soft, gritty sound, the dry crust on the windward face scraping gently against the neighboring block, and you feel its weight as you hold it before you, a weight that is noticeably less than it was when you first carried it from the cut face many hours ago. The difference is not dramatic, perhaps a pound or two of water already given up to the wind and the mild, diffuse warmth of the day. But it is enough that your arms do not strain quite as much, enough that the turf feels more like a dense, heavy loaf than a sodden, dripping block. You turn it slowly in your hands, rotating it so that the still damp inward side now faces outward and the dry, crusted windward side faces in, and you set it down carefully on the heather beside you while you reach for the second turf of the footing. This second turf you lift and turn in the same way, feeling the same slightly reduced weight, the same contrast between the dry face and the damp, and you place it on the ground beside the first, so that the three turves of the footing lie side by side, their newly exposed damp surfaces already beginning to glisten faintly in the moving air. The third turf comes away last, and when you lift it, you notice that it was the one on the very top of the footing, the capstone of the little pyramid, and its underside, which was pressed against the junction of the two lower blocks, is still completely wet, almost as dark and heavy as when it was first cut. You turn this one with particular care, handling its softened, damp face gently so as not to tear the fibers, and you set it beside its companions on the heather, a small line of dark rectangles waiting to be restacked. Now you begin to rebuild the footing, starting with the first turf you turned, the one whose dry face is now inward, and you set it on its end in its original spot, pressing its base firmly into the short heather so that it stands solid and upright. The second turf you lift and lean against the first, adjusting the angle by small, gentle nudges of your fingertips until the top edges meet and the lower edges spread apart, creating that same narrow wind-channeling gap that you built this morning, and you feel the friction between the two blocks catch and hold, the dry crust of the inward faces gripping against each other with a tiny, gritty resistance. The third turf, the former capstone, you place against the other two, completing the tripod, and you press down lightly on the apex to test the stability of the whole structure, feeling the turves lock together under the gentle pressure. The footing stands again, slightly different in color now. Its outermost face is the dark, damp brown of the previously sheltered sides. Its inward face is the lighter, drier brown of the surfaces that have been exposed to the wind all day. And you note that the wind now reaches the damp faces directly, threading through the gaps and drawing the moisture outward in a slow, invisible stream. You brush the loose crumbs of peat from your palms, clapping your hands together once with a soft, dull sound, and then you move to the next footing to repeat the process. At the second footing, the turves are a little drier than the first because they were cut later in the morning when the sun had already begun to warm the surface of the bog, and the wind had steadied into its full, mild flow, and they come apart more easily, the dry crust on the windward faces thicker and more resistant under your fingers. You lift the first turf and feel that it is lighter still, the water loss perhaps a pound or two more, and when you turn it, the damp side is not as wet as the first footing's damp sides, its surface already beginning to lose the deepest, glossiest sheen, and take on a duller, more satin-like finish. You rebuild this footing with the same careful, unhurried motions, setting each turf in place with a gentle precision that requires no measurement, only the quiet, practiced judgment of your eye and your hands. The wind, which has been steady all day, seems to pause for just a moment as you work, as if holding its breath while you complete the restacking, and then it resumes its steady flow, humming past your ears and stirring the heather with its low, continuous murmur. The sound so constant that you have long since ceased to notice it, except as a part of the overall quiet. The third footing presents a small challenge, because one of its turves, the one that was on the windward side, has dried so much at the upper edge that a thin vertical crack has appeared, a hairline fissure that runs from the top corner down toward the middle of the block. You handle this turf with extra care, lifting it very gently and turning it so slowly that the crack does not widen, and you place it in the rebuilt footing with the cracked face inward, where it will be supported by its neighbors and protected from the direct force of the wind. The crack is not a flaw, not a failure, but simply a sign that the drying is happening quickly on this particular block, perhaps because it was cut from a slightly less dense layer of peat, or because it has been in the path of the strongest gusts all afternoon, and you know that it will not grow much more as the drying slows and deepens over the coming days. This attention to the individual character of each turf, this small responsive adjustment to the shape and condition of every block, is part of the quiet skill of the work, a skill that requires no thought but only the deep intuitive knowledge that comes from many seasons spent on the bog with a wing-spade in your hands and the wind in your face. You move from footing to footing, dismantling and turning and rebuilding, and the process is so slow and so methodical that it seems to occupy a different quality of time from the cutting, a more meditative, more repetitive rhythm that asks nothing of your mind but offers a deep, abiding calm in return. Each footing comes apart in the same sequence of lifts and turns, and each one is rebuilt in the same pattern of careful placements and gentle adjustments. But the small variations from one to the next, the difference in weight, the slight changes in color, the presence or absence of tiny cracks, the way the windward crust has formed in delicate flaking layers on some blocks and in smooth hard shells on others, keep the work from becoming mechanical. Keep your senses engaged with the material reality of the peat and the wind, and the slow, patient tight as the kotake thogi the will wide way. You notice as you work that the scent of the turves has continued to change throughout the restacking, the aroma that rises from each turned block evolving from the sharp, clean, acidic smell of fresh peat into a warmer, drier, smokier fragrance that fills your nostrils with the faint, distant memory of hearth fires and winter kitchens. The smell is not strong, not heavy, but it is distinct, a quiet promise of the warmth to come, and you breathe it in as you work, finding it strangely comforting, a sensory link between this open, windy bog and the closed, cozy rooms where these same turves will one day glow red and crumble into ash. As you reach the footings that were built later in the morning, the ones that have had less time in the wind, you find that the contrast between the windward and sheltered faces is less pronounced, the damp sides still quite wet and dark, the dry sides only just beginning to crust. These turves are heavier in your hands, closer to their original weight, and they feel stickier to the touch. The peat fibers still soft and loosely packed, and you turn them with a slightly different technique, handling them more by the ends where the crust has begun to form, and avoiding pressing too hard on the damp faces with your palms. Each one you place in its new position with the damp side outward, and you adjust the gaps between the turves to be a little wider than before, because the wind will need more access to these wetter surfaces if they are to dry evenly before night falls and the cooler, damper air of evening settles over the bog. The wider gaps mean that the footings are slightly less stable, a little more open in their architecture, and you spend a few extra moments on each one, testing the balance and making tiny, incremental adjustments until the structure feels solid under your hand. The three turves leaning together in a perfect self-supporting triangle that will hold its shape through the night. The light continues to deepen as you work, the amber tones of late afternoon giving way by slow, imperceptible stages to the softer, greyer light of early evening, and the shadows that were faint and blurry an hour ago have now grown long and distinct, stretching across the heather in thin, dark ribbons that move almost visibly as the sun sinks behind the western clouds. The wind, as if sensing the approach of dusk, eases slightly, its steady push softening to a gentler drift that still moves the bog cotton and still hums through the gaps in the footings, but does so with a quieter, more muted voice, a voice that seems to hush the whole bog into a state of deepening stillness. A curlew calls somewhere to the north, its haunting, piping notes carrying clearly across the open ground, and then it falls silent, leaving behind a small, echoing emptiness that is slowly filled by the rustle of the heather and the soft, constant sigh of the air. You pause in your work and straighten your back, your hands resting on your hips, and you look out over the footings you have already restacked. their dark triangular shapes now all facing the wind with their damp sides exposed, their dry sides tucked safely inward, and you feel the same quiet, steady satisfaction that you felt this morning when the first turf was laid on the heather, a satisfaction that is not prideful, but simply the calm acknowledgement of work done well and at its proper pace. You return to the task and work through the remaining footings, the ones at the far end of the cluster, where the turves are the freshest and heaviest, and by the time you lift and turn the last turf of the last footing, your hands are thoroughly stained with the dark, fine dust of the drying peat, a dust that has worked its way into every crease of your palms and under every fingernail and into the halls of your fingertips until your hands look like they have been dipped in dark, crushed earth. The last footing is rebuilt with the same careful attention as the first, the damp faces turned outward, the dry faces inward, the gaps adjusted to catch the breeze, and you press down on the apex with a final gentle push that confirms the structure is stable and true. You step back and look at the whole cluster of footings, the small dark pyramids, standing in their refreshed formations, their newly exposed damp surfaces glistening faintly in the fading light, and you understand that they are now perfectly aligned with the steady wind, every turf positioned to give up its moisture as evenly and efficiently as the slow, patient processes of air and time will allow. Nothing more can be done for them today. The night will do its own work, the cool air drawing the moisture upward and outward by slow degrees. And when you return tomorrow or the day after, you will find them lighter again, drier again, ready for another turning and another step on their long journey from wet peat to winter fuel. You brush the dark crumbs of peat from your palms, clapping your hands together with a soft, muffled sound that is swallowed almost instantly by the open air, and you wipe the remaining dust on the coarse fabric of your breeches, leaving two long, dark smears on your thighs. The scent of the dry peat clings to your skin, that warm, smoky, earthy fragrance that you have been breathing all afternoon, and you lift your hands to your face and smell them. A quiet, unconscious gesture that brings you a small measure of comfort, a sensory reminder of the work and the bog, and the slow, cyclical rhythm of the seasons. You look once more at the footings, the quiet village of dark shapes standing in the grey evening light, and then you turn and begin the slow walk back toward the cut face and the spade and the leather bottle, your footsteps soft on the heather, the bog settling around you into the deep, abiding stillness of the approaching night. The light begins to fail in soft grey steps, the sky losing its pale amber colour and settling into a deeper, even shade that seems to rise from the bog itself, a slow, gentle darkening that erases the last faint shadows and returns the world to a state of muted, shadowless calm. The wind, which has blown steadily from the southwest all day, eases now to a gentle drift that barely moves the bog cotton, the white tufts nodding only occasionally. Their dance slowed to a languid, almost imperceptible sway, and the sound of the air through the heather drops from a steady hum to a soft, intermittent whisper that comes and goes like the breath of a sleeper. You stand beside the cluster of restacked footings on the higher ground, your hands resting at your sides, and you look out over the work you have done, the long, dark trough cutting through the bog, the few remaining fresh turves lying flat on the heather, waiting to be stacked another day, and the small dark pyramids of the footings standing in their quiet, orderly formation, their damp faces now turned outward to catch the last of the moving air. The day's labour is complete, and what remains is only the gathering of tools and the slow walk home across the darkening bog. You turn from the footings and walk back toward the cut face, your feet finding the narrow track of flattened heather by memory as much as by sight, because the light is now so dim that the distinctions between ground and vegetation have begun to blur into a single soft darkness. The wing-spade lies where you left it on the higher ground beside the leather bottle, its blade resting flat on the dry heather and its handle angling upward at the familiar tilt you have seen 100 times today. And you bend to pick it up, feeling the cold, smooth wood of the handle under your palm and the heavier, cooler weight of the iron blade as you lift it from the ground. A thin film of peat dust clings to the blade, the fine dark powder that has accumulated from dozens of cuts, and you wipe it clean with a handful of dry heather, the wiry stems scratching softly against the metal and leaving it dark and glistening with the faint oily residue of the bog water. The spade feels different now than it did this morning, not in its weight or balance, but in the way your hand knows it, the handle having absorbed the warmth and pressure of your grip for so many hours that it seems almost to have shaped itself to your palm. And you rest it on your shoulder with the same easy, practiced motion you used when you first stepped onto the bog in the pale morning light. You gather the leather bottle next, the stopper still secure and the remaining water sloshing faintly inside when you lift it, and you attach it to your belt with a few simple, unhurried movements, your fingers working the leather loop and tugging it snug so that the bottle will not swing or knock against your leg as you walk. The linen cloth that wrapped your bread is retrieved from the patch of heather where you sat at midday, folded once, then twice, and tucked into the small pouch at your waist, and you check the ground around you to be sure that nothing has been left behind, no stray item that might be lost in the dark or spoiled by the damp night air. Your feet have left deep impressions in the soft ground near the cut face, a series of dark, water-filled hollows that mark your path back and forth through the day, and you see, in the last of the grey light, that these footprints are already filling with water from the surrounding peat, their edges softening and their shapes becoming indistinct as the bog reclaims them. By morning they will be gone entirely, smoothed over by the slow, patient seep of the groundwater, and no sign will remain that you stood here at all. You take one last slow walk around the footings before you leave, moving among the small dark pyramids with a quiet, measured pace, and you observe the way they stand in the dimness, like quiet witnesses to the day's slow effort, their triangular shapes just barely visible against the deeper darkness of the heather. The wind, gentle as it is now, still threads through the gaps between the turves with a faint hollow sound, a sound so soft that you must stand very still to hear it, and you pause beside the first footing you built, the one that holds the earliest turves of the morning, and you reach out to touch its damp, outward-facing surface with your fingertips. The peat is cool and slightly soft, still giving up its moisture to the air, and you feel a small, quiet connection to it, a sense of having set something in motion that will continue long after you have gone, the slow, patient drying that will turn these heavy, wet blocks into fuel for the winter fires. You withdraw your hand and let it fall to your side, and you stand there for a long moment, not thinking anything in particular, simply being present with the footings and the bog and the fading light. The cold begins to make itself felt now, a gradual, creeping cool that rises from the bog floor as the air thickens and the last warmth of the afternoon dissipates into the grey sky, and you feel it settling on your exposed skin, a damp, heavy cold that is different from the sharp, dry chill of morning. It seeps through the fabric of your shirt and breeches, pressing against your shoulders and your knees and the small of your back, and you know that it is time to leave, that the bog will only grow colder and darker, and that the walk home is long enough without adding the full darkness of night to it. You turn your back on the footings, feeling a small, quiet tug of reluctance, not because you wish to stay, but because the place has held you in its stillness all day, and it is strange to leave it behind, to walk away from the cut face and the trough and the dark, drying turves that have occupied your hands and your mind since the first pale light of morning. But the reluctance is soft and passing, replaced almost at once by a calm readiness to go, to return to the farmstead and the hearth and the warmth that waits there, and you begin to walk toward the narrow track that leads across the bog. Your boots make soft, squelching sounds in the wet ground as you walk, each step pressing a shallow depression into the springy peat and releasing a faint, wet sigh, and the sounds follow you across the bog like a quiet, rhythmic companion, a small, steady noise in the vast, surrounding silence. The track is almost invisible now, just a slightly paler line of flattened heather that you follow by feel as much as by sight, and you let your feet guide you, trusting the memory in your legs that has walked this path many times before, in many seasons, under many different skies. The bog around you has settled into its evening stillness, the curlews silent, the meadow pea-pits gone to their hidden roosts. The dragonflies vanished from the dark pools, and the only movement is the slow, gentle sway of the bog cotton in the faint drift of the wind, a motion so slight that it seems almost imagined, a ghost of movement in the corner of your eye. The pools of dark water reflect nothing now. They are simple, black mirrors that hold no light and no sky, their surfaces smooth and still and impenetrable, and you pass them by without looking, your attention focused on the path and the distant, low shape of the farmstead that is just beginning to resolve itself against the darkening horizon. The walk is not hurried. You have no reason to rush and every reason to move slowly, to let the day's work settle in your bones as you cross the wide, quiet bog. The weight of the wing-spade on your shoulder is a familiar, grounding presence, and you adjust it once, shifting it slightly so that the iron socket does not press too hard against the bone, and then you let it rest, your hand draped loosely over the handle, your arm relaxed. The ache in your muscles has softened now, replaced by a deep, pleasant fatigue that runs through your whole body, a tiredness that is not painful but satisfying, the kind that comes from a full day of steady, productive labor and promises a night of deep, dreamless sleep. You breathe slowly and evenly, drawing the cool, damp air into your lungs and releasing it in long, soft exhales that form faint wisps of vapor in the darkening air. And your breath is the only part of you that seems to move quickly. Everything else is slow, measured, calm. As you walk, you let your eyes trace the distant, low hills that rise in soft, rounded shapes against the horizon, and you see that a few lights have appeared among them, small, warm pinpricks of yellow that glow faintly through the dusk. The windows of farmsteads and cottages where other people are ending their own days of labor and settling into the quiet of evening. One of these lights, the nearest and the brightest, is the window of the farmstead you left this morning in the early dark, and you fix your gaze on it as you walk, using it as a steady point of reference, a small beacon that grows slowly larger and brighter as you cross the bog. The sight of it is deeply comforting, a promise of warmth and shelter and the familiar, close smells of the kitchen, and you feel a quiet gladness rise in your chest. Not a sharp or loud emotion, but a gentle, spreading warmth that mingles with the fatigue and the peace of the ending day. The track begins to rise very slightly as you leave the wettest part of the bog behind, the ground underfoot becoming firmer and drier, the heather giving way to coarser grasses, and the occasional low, thorny bush that scratches softly against your boots. The air smells different here, less of peat and more of dry earth and grass, and the faint, sweet scent of the gorse that grows on the slopes above the bog, its yellow flowers closed now for the night, but still releasing their soft, coconut-like fragrance into the cooling air. You breathe it in deeply, letting the scent fill your lungs, and you notice that the wind has shifted slightly, now coming more from the west and carrying with it the faintest hint of the sea. A clean, salt tang that cuts through the earthy smells of the land and clears your head, refreshing you for the last stretch of the walk. Behind you, the bog is disappearing into the twilight, its wide, open expanse merging with the grey sky until the horizon is no longer a line, but a gradual, seamless blending of land and cloud, a soft, dark wash that holds no distinct shapes, no clear edges, only the deepening, uniform darkness of the May night. The footings you built are lost now, swallowed by the distance and the dark, and the cut face and the trough and the line of fresh turves are all invisible, existing only in your memory and in the quiet satisfaction that you carry with you as you walk. The bog will keep them through the night, holding them in its ancient, patient stillness, and the wind will continue its slow, steady work, drawing the moisture from the damp peat faces and carrying it away over the hills. And when you return in the morning or the day after, you will find them a little lighter, a little drier, a little closer to the fire that awaits them in the winter ahead. You reach the edge of the bog, where the rough pasture begins, the ground now sloping more steeply upward toward the farmstead, and you pass through a gap in the low stone wall that marks the boundary between the wild ground and the farmed. The stones are cold and rough under your hand as you steady yourself through the gap, their surfaces covered with a dry, grey lichen that grows on all the walls in this country, and you feel the familiar transition from the open, unenclosed bog to the smaller, more intimate spaces of the farm, the fields and the hedgerows, and the outbuildings that cluster around the house. The wing-spade shifts on your shoulder as you climb the slope, and you adjust it again, settling it into the hollow above your collarbone where it rides most comfortably. And you continue the slow, steady climb toward the warm yellow light that now glows clearly from the kitchen window, its brightness spilling out onto the dark ground and illuminating the rough, cobbled yard in front of the door. You cross the yard, your boots sounding differently on the hard, uneven stones, the soft squelch of the bog replaced by a solid, steady tread that echoes faintly off the walls of the byre and the barn, and you reach the low door of the farmstead, the same door you closed behind you in the dark of the early morning, a lifetime ago. You lean the wing-spade against the stone wall beside the door, its blade resting on the cobbles and its handle propped against the rough, whitewashed stone. And you know that you will find it there in the morning, ready for another day, another trough, another crough of dark, wet turves to be lifted from the ancient bog. You pause with your hand on the door latch, the iron cold and familiar under your palm, and you look back once over your shoulder, across the dark fields and the low stone wall to the bog beyond. But there is nothing to see now, only the deep, soft darkness of the May night, and the faint, distant sigh of the wind still moving over the heather, and the quiet, silent, patient stacks of turf standing unseen, drying in the Irish wind.